So in this video, we'll take a look at an example of a long reading passage, applying some of the ideas that we've talked about in the previous two videos as far as the anatomy of a GRE reading passage and then the idea of reading actively. But first, a few details about long passages. So there's going to be one of these per test, and it will usually be in the first verbal section. What makes something a quote-unquote long passage is that it will include generally 3 to 5 paragraphs, somewhere between 75 and 85 lines. It will have 4 questions. So again, just one of the passages will have the 4 questions associated with it. And so if we think about this idea of spending a minute and a half per question, that would mean you'd want to budget or allow yourself about 6 minutes to get through the long passage. And then to further break that down, try to get through the reading and annotating part of it in 3 minutes or less. That would leave you 3 minutes or more to answer the questions and reread as needed. And we want to emphasize this part because you don't need to absorb everything there is to absorb on your first pass through it. In other words, in the first 3 minutes. You want to filter out those details rather than getting bogged down in them, because if there are details that you need to extract, you can always come back and get those later. And we'll see some examples of how we can do that when we look at the questions on this passage. One more note, though, about the structure of the long passages. So generally, you'll encounter one of 2 scenarios. One is that it'll involve a discussion of a single theory or hypothesis, and we're using these terms broadly. It might be a scientific theory, it might be some theory or idea in the humanities, literature, etc., etc. So it doesn't have to be a scientific theory or hypothesis, but we'll just use those terms. So if you have a passage about a single theory, there's going to be some background about that topic, some introduction of the theory or hypothesis that they're discussing. They'll give some or describe some supporting details for that theory and generally offer a brief discussion of the implications of that. So this is, again, the anatomy that we talked about in the second video of our reading portion. They won't necessarily come in this order, but those are some of the ingredients you want to be mindful of as you're reading one of these passages. And then if they're not talking about a single theory or hypothesis, they'll probably be talking about 2 of them, competing or rival theories, hypotheses, ideas, etc. And so in this case, there will generally be some assertion from the author's point of view about which theory or hypothesis is better, and we can put that in quotes, which one better accounts for the data or the evidence, which one leaves fewer anomalies unaccounted for, that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and look at an example of a long passage, and this is split over 3 slides because this one contains 3 paragraphs. So first paragraph. Recent studies of sediment in the North Atlantic's deep waters reveal possible cyclical patterns in the history of Earth's climate. The rock fragments in these sediments are too large to have been transported there by ocean currents. They must have reached their present locations by traveling in large icebergs that floated long distances from their point of origin before melting. So we'll note right here a couple of things that stand out. They must have, and they were too large. So that's an assertion by the author. It could very well be backed up by evidence, but the author is sort of staking a claim or making a claim there. We'll keep on reading, though. Geologist Gerard Bond noticed that some of the sediment grains were stained with iron oxide, evidence that they originated in locales where glaciers had overrun outcrops of red sandstone. And there I'm just flagging the word evidence. We're not going to worry about all the specifics, but we'll note that, hey, here's some important evidence that they're going to draw on as far as supporting some specific theory. So Bond's detailed analysis of deep water sediment cores showed changes in the mix of sediment sources over time. The proportions of these red stained grains fluctuated back and forth from lows of 5% to highs of about 17%, and these fluctuations occurred in a nearly regular 1,500-year cycle. So something that we might do here that could be helpful would be to draw a little diagram where we have something fluctuating in a cycle, and then the high would be this 17%, the low, this 5%, and then that's taking 1,500 years, so we could do something like that. And then another important thing is in the first part of this sentence, before the colon, and what we can note here is this idea that something is changing over time. His analysis revealed that such and such changed over time. The composition of these sediments, and that reveals something about what? Well, there's some kind of cycle that is revealed in terms of these sediments. And so again, we don't want to get too bogged down in the details, and you'll note that I wrote the 17% and the 5%. That's just kind of a way of taking down some information. We're not going to get too hung up on those specific numbers. What's really important here is we've got some background, we've got an assertion by the author, they introduce the scientist, they point out that there's some important evidence, and then his analysis of that evidence revealed certain changes over time, this cyclical pattern. So if we wanted to summarize this with a single line, we could say something like fluctuating sediment levels reflect changes in global climate. And then on the actual test, you could abbreviate that even more. But here at 8 words, that's not too much. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words. Next paragraph. Bond hypothesized that the alternating cycles might be evidence of changes in ocean water circulation and therefore in Earth's climate. So hypothesize, that's one of these important words in a scientific passage. He knew that the sources of the red stain grains were generally closer to the North Pole than were the places yielding a high proportion of so-called clean grains. At certain times, apparently, more icebergs from the Arctic Ocean in the far north were traveling south well into the North Atlantic before melting and shedding their sediment. So this is, again, one of these paragraphs where if you try to absorb all of what's going on as you're reading it, it can feel a little overwhelming in the sense that you might need some sort of flow chart or diagram. And while that sort of thing can be helpful, again, we don't want to get too bogged down. One thing that can really help us avoid getting bogged down is to focus on really the purpose. What is the purpose of this paragraph? And the purpose here is really to describe his hypothesis. And we see some of the language here, words like apparently and might be. Those words suggest that we're not dealing with certainties. We're dealing with possibilities, or again, hypotheses. And so our main idea here could basically just be, this is Bond's hypothesis on the relationship between sediment levels and climate. If we really wanted to be concise, we could just say Bond's hypothesis, but maybe adding a little bit about what that hypothesis concerns or deals with could be helpful, and so that's what we have there. Last paragraph. The onset of the so-called Little Ice Age, which followed the medieval warm period of the 8th through 10th centuries, may represent the most recent time that the ocean's dynamic changed in this way. If ongoing climate history studies support Bond's hypothesis of 1,500-year cycles, scientists may establish a major natural rhythm in Earth's temperatures that could then be extrapolated into the future. So we see a lot of these caution words again. May, could, if. So that suggests that what we're dealing with here is uncertain, even if grounded in fact. Because the midpoint of the medieval warm period was about 850 AD, an extension of Bond's cycles would place the midpoint of the next warm interval in the 24th century. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? Well, we're dealing with implications. We're dealing with implications of his hypothesis for the future. This is sort of fleshing out the gist of what his predictions are, but implications of Bond's hypothesis. So we take those 3 paragraph summaries and put them together, and we have a pretty good roadmap of the passage. Fluctuating sediment levels reflect changes in global climate. Bond has a hypothesis on the relationship between sediment levels and climate, and then there are some implications of that hypothesis. So what can we do with this? Well, a lot of times these paragraph summaries will give us a head start on certain individual questions, as we'll see, but they can also help in terms of extracting or summing up the main idea of the passage overall. And here we can say something like, Bond's hypothesis on the relationship between sediment levels and past climate cycles leads to predictions about future trends. That's longer than something you might want to write down on the actual test again, but you could abbreviate. But it's a good idea to get in the habit of thinking in terms of the main idea, because quite often when you're dealing with a long passage or even a short passage, you'll have questions asking about the main idea. And the more thinking you do in terms of extracting or ferreting out a main idea while you're reading, the more likely you are to get those questions correct, the less likely you are to be distracted by wrong answers that they place in front of you. So let's move on to the questions, keeping in mind that we will be taking a more detailed look at these different question types in the subsequent videos. Okay, so our first question here is a detail question. We know it's a detail question because of these words, according to the passage. So when you see these words, that means that you want to find some evidence that is more or less explicitly stated, and the correct answer should be a relatively close paraphrase of that. The question asks, which of the following is true of the rock fragments contained in the sediments studied by Bond? Now, this is an open-ended question in the sense that it's asking which of the following is true, but we still want to try to find something in the passage before we look to the answer choices. And that's a key idea. We don't want to get distracted by the choices. So we want to do our thinking first, then look for the answer. So let's find something that it says about rock fragments contained in these sediments. And we'll find it right here. So I've only used the relevant paragraph on this slide because it would be quite difficult to fit all the text on here and have it still be readable. Okay, so it says the rock fragments in these sediments are too large to have been transported there by ocean currents. They must have reached their present locations by traveling in large icebergs that floated long distances from their point of origin before melting. Okay, they traveled long distances before melting. So we come up with our approximate answer. They traveled in large icebergs and use that as we turn our attention to the answer choices. So the majority of them are composed of red sandstone. Nope. They must have reached their present location over 1,500 years ago. Nope. And we'll note the words must have. That kind of extreme wording is something you want to be very cautious about in terms of, you see that in an answer choice. It's going to need a lot of evidence to support it in order for that to be correct. So it's probably going to be incorrect if it uses that kind of language. They were carried by icebergs to their present location. They traveled in large icebergs. They were carried by icebergs. That's a pretty good match, but let's just check the last two choices to be sure. Most of them were carried to their present location during a warm period. No. It's actually the opposite. And they are unlikely to have been carried to their present location during the Little Ice Age. And no. Next question. In the final paragraph of the passage, the author is primarily concerned with what? Here we see a very clear example of how the paragraph summaries give us a really good head start on certain questions. So in this case, recall that our paragraph summary was implications of Bond's hypothesis. So a lot of times keeping in mind the purpose of the paragraph as opposed to all the specific content details, the purpose could very well be enough to lead you to the correct answer. So implications of Bond's hypothesis. So he's not answering a question about climate history. They're not pointing out a potential flaw. They're not suggesting a new focus for studying ocean sediments. They're not tracing the general history of the Earth's climate. Nope, they're discussing possible implications of Bond's hypothesis. It doesn't always work out that neatly, but sometimes it does, and that's always a nice bonus. Next question. So we have another one of these according to the passage questions. He hypothesized that which of the following circumstances would allow red-stained sediment grains to reach more southerly latitude. So I've zeroed in on the relevant paragraph here, but keep in mind that during the test, something that can really help you zero in on those paragraphs will be those paragraph summaries. So this is where it describes his hypothesis on this relationship. So then we get into the specific details that are needed to answer this question. So it says here, he knew that the sources of these red stain grains were generally closer to the North Pole than were places yielding a high proportion of clean grains. So that means they were up here. And then it says, at certain times, more icebergs from the Arctic Ocean in the far north were traveling south before melting and shedding their sediment. So if there were certain times when the icebergs were traveling farther south before melting, that means it was probably cold, right? Because in order for them to travel farther without melting, it would need to be colder than it was at other times when they didn't travel as far south before melting. So, unlike some of the according to the passage questions, this one requires a bit of an inference. We have to go a little bit beyond what's directly stated, but not too far beyond it. So our approximate answer here could be something like, well, it's colder. Now that's really simple, but let's just see what we can find with that word in mind. Warm waters being pulled northward? No. Climatic conditions causing icebergs to melt relatively quickly? Nope. Icebergs containing a higher proportion of iron oxide than usual? Nope. The formation of more icebergs than usual? That's not quite the same thing as the slower melting that's being described here. And then so we get to the last choice, and that turns out to be correct. The presence of cold surface waters in the North Atlantic. And again, the idea here is that if you have cold surface waters, icebergs are close to the surface, those cold surface waters are going to keep the icebergs from melting as quickly as they otherwise would have. So as we see here, our approximate answers can be pretty approximate and still lead us to the actual correct answer. And the last question, an inference question, it says, it can be inferred from the passage that in sediment cores from the North Atlantic's deep waters, the portions that correspond to the Little Ice Age blank. So another one of these open-ended questions, and we'll also note that it's an inference question. So in contrast to the according to the passage questions, the specific detail questions, inference questions do tend to require a little more reading between the lines, but we still want our answer to be based on specific evidence from the passage. We don't want to start assuming. We want to use inferences that are based on evidence from the passage. And so let's see what we can find regarding sediment cores from the North Atlantic's deep waters and the Little Ice Age. So two relevant portions here. One of them is up here where it says the proportions of these red stained grains fluctuated from lows of 5% to highs of about 17%. And then what did Bond say? He said that the sources of these red stained grains in the sediments were places that were closer to the North Pole. At certain times, more icebergs from the Arctic Ocean were traveling south before melting and shedding their sediment. So what this means is that at those times, when more icebergs were traveling south before melting, you're going to have more of these red stained grains traveling south. That means that when it's colder, you're going to have a higher percentage. So something closer to 17% as opposed to 5%. So we'll use that as our approximate answer, turn our attention to the answer choices. Do they differ very little in composition? No, that's the opposite of what he said. They differ quite a bit in composition. They fluctuate significantly between the portions, so it looks good to begin with, but 1300s to the 1700s, remember that he said, or he identified a pattern of about 1500 years, so relative to that, that's pretty small. That's a pretty small amount of time, and so that doesn't quite work. They would be likely to contain a proportion closer to 17% than to 5%. That's a pretty good match. But let's check the other two. They show a much higher proportion of red stained grains. So this is throwing in some details that do not actually correspond with what's in the passage. They weren't extracted from the far north. They came from the far north. So it's taking some little specifics from the passage and sort of jumbling them up. So we want to be wary of those types of incorrect answers. And then they were formed in part as a result of Gulf Stream waters having been pulled northward. No. So there's our correct answer. So that will do it for our long passage. In the subsequent videos, we will look more closely at different types of questions that we encounter on long and or short passages. So basically any reading passages that are not the argument-based passages. But that'll do it for now.